Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and welcome to our interactive online course on the book, The Stress Solution, Using Empathy to Reduce Stress, Anxiety, and Fear. And Arthur, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Arthur Ciaramicoli. I'm a clinical psychologist and an author, and obviously the author of this book.
And the book is The Stress Solution, Using Empathy, Cognitive Behavior Therapy to Reduce Anxiety and Develop Resilience. And the format we're using today is to have a Q&A around the book, Chapter 3, which is Empathic Listening, Loving Away the Stress. That's loving away the stress. I really like that. So, yeah, take it away, Arthur.
But have you all read the chapter? I didn't meet everyone. I met Lou, and I can barely see.
And my name's Betty. I just bought the book a few days ago, so I haven't even read it yet.
Hi, Betty.
As I bought the book, we were talking about creating an empathic sort of culture within our organization, so I wanted to learn more about that.
Okay, what is your organization?
I work for Workers' Compensation Board, and I work for the Rehabilitation Center, so specifically more with brain injuries and PTSD clients. So
interesting work. Okay. So any questions? Lou, did you read the chapter?
I have not read the chapter. I have the book on order. I do have, however, a question.
Uh-huh.
And the question is, how do you define empathy?
I define empathy as the capacity to understand and respond to the unique experiences of another.
And so thank you for that. And how do you distinguish that, let's say, from compassion?
I knew you were going to ask that question.
So you'll perhaps be ready.
Compassion can be a part of empathy. One can feel compassionate, but empathy can be experienced without compassion. For instance, good salesmen have empathy, because empathy in many ways is everyday mind reading. It has been called everyday mind reading. So if I'm going to sell you a car, and I can anticipate by understanding you or sensing what you want to hear or what I need to do to manipulate you, I can use empathy as a tool. I said in my first book, The Power of Empathy, which I took a lot of heat from journalists, that Hitler had empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a dark side of empathy. Psychopaths can have empathy. So it doesn't necessarily go along with compassion, but it can contain compassion when it's used for positive effects and outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have a little bit of a dialogue here, Arthur and I, about this chapter. And I have actually a bit of a different view on the definitions of empathy. But to start with, I'll just maybe give an overview of the framework of the book and this chapter. So the book basically goes in and says stress, anxiety, and fear are based on cortisol, and that stress, sustained stress, has many negative effects on our body and well-being, and that empathy, or relational empathy, transforms that stress cortisol to connection, calmness, and well-being, and also to the hormone or neuropeptide oxytocin. And then the chapter goes through, reviews the blocks to empathy. So you've got a series of blocks, things that you're seeing block empathy, and then there's a section on how to do empathic listening, and then Arthur, you also share stories and offer exercise to foster empathy. Is that kind of a, would you say that's fair take on the chapter? Or would you
Yes,
like to expand?
that's a nice summary, actually, Edwin. And one of the premises of the book is that when we give and receive empathy, we learn to perceive more accurately. We learn to perceive more accurately the truth of ourselves and others. And I've been doing, actually just came from my 2 group therapy sessions. I have 3 group therapy sessions of different ages that have been ongoing for over 30 years. And as people learn to listen empathically, they discover more and more of their own biases toward themselves and others. Because when we slow down the process, and for instance tonight we had a couple of people reacting very quickly to some issues around intimacy in a marriage, and based on their own experiences, and they at that point, when they were reacting very emotionally, they stopped listening empathically. And through that interchange, we were able to understand where their biases were. So when we're in a group situation and people are giving and receiving empathy and slowing down the process, it helps to understand where your biases are so that you can learn and discipline yourself to perceive more and more accurately. And as we perceive more accurately, we're able to listen in more depth with more accuracy.
I have
So
a
I did.
question.
Oh, go ahead, Betty.
So is there a point where you can become too empathic towards your clients? Or, for instance, if a person is suffering from CPS, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is that going to trigger you if you are having to practice empathy all the time?
No, I would say that people often say to me, I have too much empathy. And I say to them, if you're actually practicing empathy, you can't have too much. Because empathy teaches you where your own biases are and how to get too close. It tells you who to get too close to and who to remain distant from. For instance, I just came from a group where one of the women does have PTSD. And her fear of hurting anyone's feelings is so dramatic that even when she gave an example of when she's in an airport, she starts to cry because she feels so sad for all the people saying goodbye to everyone. And she's assuming that they're all saying goodbye under negative circumstances, that this is, you know, a tragic ending, an abandonment, a breakup, rather than maybe they had a happy vacation and they're saying goodbye to each other. So she says, I have too much empathy. No, what she has is she has too much identification with sadness, and it's not worked out. And she's too close to the trauma in her life, which has not been worked out yet, so that she's projecting it onto other people, and she's assuming that's empathy. That's not empathy. Empathy is a slowed down response where we're more objective. So when we're objective and we're seeing clearly, we don't go in too far where we're over our heads and we don't have a boundary. We have a boundary that allows us to see clearly. So I think when people say, I have too much and I can't sleep at night, I feel the pain of the world, it's usually pointing to something historical. And as you know, I mean, people with PTSD, they're often reacting from their history. They're placing, you know, old faces on new faces, and they call it empathy, but it really isn't empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Good answer. That makes sense.
I did want to mention about the definition of empathy, Arthur, is that for me, empathy is a feeling into the experience of self and others, but it can be seen in an individualistic way, that I feel into your experience or into my own experience, but there's also what I would call a relational or systemic empathy, where we see the full constellation of relationships. Like right now, there's a series of relationships between the four of us. So there's, if we see the whole of the relationship, if I'm the used car salesman and I'm empathizing with your situation and then starting to manipulate you, that part that's the manipulation I would not see as empathy. I would say that's actually a block to empathy. So that the used car salesman is no longer sharing the feeling into their honest experience, and others are not able to see into him. So it's really that that deception is not empathy. He maybe has some empathy, but the part of the deception is not empathic.
I would disagree a bit, Edwin, because I've seen people feel into other people's experience and be expert at it in using empathy to then manipulate them. Yeah, so I think you can feel into another person's experience and understand them in depth and really disguise the function that may have for you. Okay.
So that, I would say, that disguised function, is that a lack of empathy?
Not necessarily, because empathy is an objective capacity. It's an objective tool. It can be used for positive or negative purposes.
So then you would be thinking more along the lines of sympathy rather than empathy when you're feeling for somebody, correct or incorrect?
Well, sympathy is an identification with, meaning that if you say, gee, your father passed away or your mother did, and I say, oh, I know exactly how you feel. My father passed away last year too. I don't know exactly how you feel. Sympathy rushes in an effort to console. Empathy stands back in an effort to understand. I don't know that your experience is the same as my experience. Sympathy assumes. It's an identification with what I went through, you must have gone through. So I'm assuming I know you, but I don't really know you.
So do you find a lot of people, they mix up those two emotions, sympathy and empathy? Or is
Yes.
it even an emotion rather than a skill?
Well, empathy is certainly a skill, but yes, exactly, because many people who think especially the people who think they're overwrought with empathy, it's often sympathy. Like the woman in the airport. Her parents, her elderly parents, were involved in concentration camps in Germany. It's a German family, and they are so. She grew up with all these stories, and so her reaction. She talks about herself as an empath and being very empathic, but really it's more sympathy. Mm-hmm. It's more, as soon as she sees tears, there's something dangerous and awful happen. You know, no one can be tearing and it being the result of something possibly positive, or even possibly something that may be growth promoting, meaning they're learning something, and maybe their feelings are hurt, but they can learn something. But her reactions become so extreme, and she calls that empathy, but it really is more sympathy.
So are you saying that she begins by feeling into their experience, she sees their tears, and then she has a reaction to it, and she's calling her reaction empathy?
Yes, she's seeing into their tears, and she has tears at the same time. And once she starts emoting, she's not being as objective. Mm-hmm. She's not seeing it clearly. Because for me to understand your experience clearly, for me to use empathy, the capacity for empathy to its full extent, I have to be a little removed. I can feel into, but I have to put my own experience aside. That's why people often say to me, you know, because I'm in private practice and I see many patients in the course of a week, so they say, oh, aren't you getting worn out? Isn't it so tiresome? I say, no, it's basically a mental vacation from myself because I'm in somebody else's movie. When you're truly listening, from an empathic perspective, you are absorbed in the other person's experience and trying to understand that experience. You are feeling into their experience, but you're leaving your own behind. You're not comparing and contrasting everything in your life to everything in their life. I'm experiencing your movie anew.
Okay. Any thoughts or questions?
Well, this is Lou speaking, my thoughts are widespread agreement. And sometimes, you know, I would have more to say if I weren't so thoroughly in agreement. So let me pretend to disagree for the sake of a productive conversation.
Sure.
And I'm not even sure it is a disagreement. The challenge, the challenge is one challenge is to make empathy present, to surface empathy. People are dealing, you know, you've spoken powerfully, I think, and elegantly about the work you're doing with survivors of various kinds, and you're not the only one on the call who works in that area, of course. Our other colleague is working with working with PTSD survivors, and so here's thank you. I'm thinking out loud here, as you probably can tell. How does empathy make a difference? Of course, in the subtitle of the book, reduce stress, and that makes a difference. Mm-hmm. Would it be useful to drill down a bit on, or to look in more detail, to inquire into what is actually the mechanism, or that's a word and maybe not the best one. What's the process or function or whatever? What's going on there that when you succeed and when I succeed or someone else in being empathic with another person, what happens? How does that make a difference? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, you're asking like if when we're being empathic with someone, there's a positive benefit that's happening.
It does seem so, yeah.
And what is the cause of that positive benefit?
I'm willing to work with causation, correlation, all of the above.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's an extremely important question, Louis.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, say a person has even PTSD or any unresolved hurt from the past. So they have a fear of being vulnerable. and people tell them, you know, you should get over it, or think positive, or they read a few self-help books or whatever. But what happens in an empathic interchange? People tell me all the time that, you know, oh, I referred this person to you, but he won't talk, or my husband won't talk, or my wife isn't very verbal. But human beings, when they are engaged in an empathic interaction, will talk. What happens? If I begin to understand you on a level that you have not experienced before, there begins to be a chemical change. It may not happen in the first interview, but it usually does. Because I always say to people, if you can get this from a friend, you shouldn't be coming to me. Because my job is to understand you on an in-depth level that maybe hasn't been experienced before. And when that happens, when a person starts to feel understood, which all human beings have a craving for, when their hurts and their issues and their experiences begin to be understood, they start to have a chemical change. And when that chemical change starts to occur, oxytocin is released. When oxytocin is released, it diminishes cortisol. Cortisol contracts empathy, oxytocin expands empathy. So now you have an empathic range that's like this, like a wide lens camera. When people are stressed or have unresolved hurts or their hearts are broken, their thinking becomes very narrow because they are stressed, and cortisol produces negative repetitive thinking as well as depression and anxiety. When a person starts to feel understood, and as they feel understood, in that understanding, in that moment of understanding, some hope begins to emerge because they can see that you're understanding them in a way that they haven't even understood themselves. And it begins to open up that camera. And as that oxytocin is released little by little, people become less fearful, they're more able to be vulnerable, they're less afraid, and all of a sudden their eyes start to open up and they begin to tell you more. And you know, Douglas Steere, his definition, he's a theologian, his definition of holy listening is one that I love, because he said holy listening is when you listen in a person's soul into a position of disclosure and discovery. And that's what empathic listening is. Human beings cannot resist it, even if they've been damaged. You know, I tell a story once of, I saw a boy who was he had lived in 7 foster homes when I used to work with a lot of adolescents. And he had been hit by 2 different foster fathers, somewhat dramatically. I knew him in a psychiatric hospital. Anyway, long story short, came to see me as an outpatient, used to always have to be the last patient because he could leave the door open. Because I'm a male and he's afraid of me. Okay, so one time after about 18 months of therapy, he came in and he closed the door. And he's talking, he's telling me about his girlfriend, how he's doing in high school. I said, Bobby. He said, what? I said, you closed the door. He said, well, so what? I said, you closed the door. Because he felt so safe at that point. The door was closed and it didn't even matter to him because he was now having a different experience through that empathic immersion. And there's a chemical change that takes place. And when that chemical change takes place, it creates security. It creates the ability to be open and vulnerable because it creates trust. I don't fear you anymore. You are a human being who's going to help me, not hurt me. And now you're unleashing something in that person's soul. I always tell people, it's not about so much finding out what's wrong with you. It's uncovering what's always been right with you. This is a kid who thinks he's not good enough, he's not smart enough, he's not handsome enough, he's not athletic enough. None of it's true. And that's what empathy does for people. It helps them uncover what the truth is about themselves. And when we're, like great marriages, people give and receive it. Change happens in the interpersonal encounter. So husband and wife, when they do this, just like good friends who do it, they give and receive empathy. And through that empathy, understanding increases and increases and increases. And we grow.
So I look at the kind of the mechanism for the empathy, like what is the, you know, what's really the positive, what's really happening in that interchange. And part of it seems to be about synchronization, that when we synchronize with others, that there's some kind of that oxytocin gets released. So if you're seeing dance, you know, people do dance together, they move in synchronized motion, and there's a certain kind of a harmony, sort of a beauty in it, a relaxation. And also I think with the empathic listening, where you hear someone and you allow them into you in that sort of a synchronization I think that's maybe somehow one of the releasing mechanisms, that when we feel in sync with someone else, that it releases that stress, and it feels there's that synchronization creates safety. Even if it's not a verbal reflection, you can still feel yourself reflected in the other person or seen.
Yes.
I have a perfect example of that. I just got back from my daughter's first psychology appointment. She's needed psychology for a long time, and she's going for CBT. And as she got into the vehicle, she just had this light in her face, because it's the first person who has been able to understand and empathize with her, and in fact tell her exactly how she's feeling and why she's feeling it. So I understand exactly what you were saying.
Yeah. And a lot of times when a young person goes into therapy, you assume they're not going to talk, they don't want to be there. But then when that change happens, it's very surprising to parents that that person actually wants to come back.
I was doing some mediation with my nephews and nieces, and they're only like 5 and 7 years old, and they'd gotten into a fight, and my nephew went running into his room and was just sitting there laying on his bed like, I'm not going to talk to anybody. And I went up there and brought my niece who had been involved in the conflict, and I said, well, let's do an empathy circle. And my nephew's like, he's not going to talk. It's like, and I said, are you feeling, he wouldn't even dialogue. I said, are you feeling hurt? And he said, yeah. Just kind of shook his head. And I said, do you want to talk? No. And so you just want to be quiet. Yeah. And then, but we kept going. It was just seeing his feeling, reflecting his feeling, started opening him up, and there came a point where he finally did start talking, and then they kind of solved the problem. But it was, but it was just kind of doing a little bit of a feelings guess. Like I could see he was, in pain, so I just shared that, and it just started this whole dialogue going, even though he was like totally closed off.
And I would guess that your love for him and your warmth in trying it, rather than yelling at him or being punitive, you're trying to feel your way through it. Like, are you upset? Are you hurt? Are you, and you're looking for his input. So it's an open-ended, you're trying to have an open-ended dialogue. Give me some information. I'm guessing a little bit, but I want you to be the authority. And then he kind of lets you know. But it's the warmth that you entered into it that kind of softens him a little bit.
Yeah, and Crystal had...
It would have been very different.
Mm-hmm. Well, Crystal had joined us. I just muted you, Crystal, because there's a little background noise. Did you have a question?
Not at this moment. I'm just catching up with the conversation and where it's going.
Okay, well, great. Glad you could join us. So I just want to be sure we included you. So, one thing you did talk about in the chapter, what I really enjoyed was you laid out the blocks to empathy. And so you said, some of the blocks were blaming, mind reading, negativity, negative predictions, projecting, microsecond reactions, personalizing, assumed similarities, and I think one was giving advice or advice giving. So do you have any more thoughts about those? The one that I saw that was new was mind reading, and I wondered maybe you could share a bit before that. I hadn't really heard that. I've heard of mind reading, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of being a block to empathy.
Well, we were talking about people who are traumatized, for instance, and there's such a sensitivity from that old conditioning that, for instance, you're frowning, so I say, well, how come you're angry with me? That's mind reading. And then you say, I'm frowning because I have a headache. And that's when you can slow down the interaction. That's where empathy can correct the distortion. All of the pieces that you just mentioned, they're all ways that we distort the truth. And what I'm encouraging people in the book is to identify the ways that we do that, because we all grow up with certain biases. It's trying to identify, do you tend to personalize? Are you that sensitive that everything is very personal? You can't see situations that come up? It's personal rather than situational. But mind reading means I'm so sensitive that I read in immediately, and I'm reading in inaccurately. Again, putting old faces on new faces. So my father hit me, and my father was an angry man, and when he frowned, I knew that was going to be a bad night. So you frown, and you're angry with me. No, you're not angry with me. I'm assuming you're angry with me. It's always, empathy always teases out the assumptions based on past conditioning. You know, we grow up in our little world, in our little family, and it's like growing up in a country where we think we have a representative sample. You know, you would never do a study on 3 or 4 people and say that it's an accurate study. But basically our minds, you know, that's emotional conditioning. It's embedded in a deep part of the brain that when we see certain expressions, we read in a certain way. You know, you and I talked when we did our interview a while ago, Edwin, about, you know, I had a fellow who was 6'7" who was added to one of my groups, and he's a recovering alcoholic. One of my patients was married to a man 6'5" who was an alcoholic who was very physically abusive. So what did she assume as soon as she came in? She said, "I bet you have a violent past." And this guy never hurt anybody in his life. He was not that kind of person. And so he did drink, but he was in recovery and working through it. But immediately as she saw a man very tall, sort of husky, who also had a problem with alcohol, there was a mind reading. There was an assumption of he's going to be violent. That's what mind reading.
Do you see that different as judgment and projection? Are you seeing, are those kind of the similar category, or
similar category, because it is a projection of what I believe based on insufficient data.
Yeah.
You know Hillary Clinton was the founder of ISIS, right? You know that?
Yeah. Well, we can. That's a bottomless pit. But to your point, I mean, that I would think that would be very powerful in getting an individual off of whatever the issue is, to have one's expectation disconfirmed in that way. That he's big and whatever, alcohol, and guess what? He's really a pussycat. He's hurting himself. He's damaging his liver, but so far nobody but him has been hurt. And if it's not, the person has to get access and be open to having their expectations disconfirmed. Yes, and I'd be interested to hear whether, and if not, then there's something there that can be itself become the, if you will, the target of therapeutic intervention.
You know, we're talking about more grave disturbances in people, but we all have these subtle ways that we misperceive.
Yeah, I got that. Yeah.
You look at me and you say, "Oh, gee, you don't even realize, we don't even realize most of the time that our brains are already recording things." I did an experiment that I told Edwin about when I used to work in a hospital. We had a one-way mirror. So I had 10 people on one side of the mirror, and then I had 10 people on the other side. One couldn't see the other side. And I asked the 10 people who were looking, one could see the other side, but they couldn't see us. And I asked them, "What do you think of those 10 people?" And they said, "Oh, we can't say it. We can't even hear what they're saying." Do you know, after 20 minutes, when I got them to calm down, they were each writing a book about those 10 people. "Oh, I think he probably went to Harvard," or "That guy's a blue-collar guy," or "I bet she's arrogant," or "This one's this." Because I got them to realize what those immediate reactions that we have that we're not even aware of, and that's where the biases are. And then when we slowed it all down, people realized that they were making 100 assumptions based on nothing else but appearance. And of course, what I was trying to teach is that we all do that. It's not just people who had PTSD or had terrible childhood. We all do it. We do it with each other. Right? We do it with the people we live with. But when we slow down and we develop that process and we use the thinking part of the brain and we produce these calming neurochemicals, we start to see reality. You know, I have a number of examples in the book of couples that sort of talk at each other and they're not understanding much at all, but when you slow them down and you get to help them have empathy for each other, they see how they're reading in all the time. One of my clients said, "I finally figured it out." Well, I was doing marital therapy, and he said, you take all the crap from your history and you dump it in the middle of the room, and then your wife takes all the crap from her history and then dump it in the room, and then we point at each other and say, "You should cure me." You know, because people don't even realize that they're projecting all this stuff that isn't even there, and it's on very subtle levels, even in healthy relationships. People have to learn where they're biased. In healthy relationships, we still have biases. We still grew up with biases.
just to reinforce the point. I don't put the cap on the toothpaste, or she doesn't put the cap on the toothpaste, and I make it mean the marriage is over. Of course, I'm making that's a joke, right? I mean, you got to pause for laugh. Pause, but there's truth to it.
Yes, there's absolutely truth to it.
Yeah.
You know, people come in and they say, well, you know, he drops his clothes on the floor every night. If he loved me, he'd pick them up. No. Not
exactly.
No, he's just a slob, you know. But it doesn't mean he doesn't love you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a person who's looking for signs of what love means. They don't really understand. You know, they're trying to get their bearings. So, oh, you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. So that means this, and you know, I mean, and some people are very funny about it. Like a couple the other night, the wife said, "Well, my husband, if he loved me, he wouldn't have a dishwasher phobia. You know, he never puts things in the dishwasher, and it drives her crazy." And I said, "Like, how many dishes does he leave out? You know, well, he leaves out his coffee cup in the morning and his cereal bowl." And I said, "And that bothers you all day long?" She goes, "If he cared, that bowl would be, you know." And I'm not promoting the guy from leaving his bowl and his coffee cup in the sink, but you're preoccupied with that for 6 hours during the day?
Well, I mean, this is where perhaps the psychodynamic, shall we say, approach has its uses, because I am willing to bet dollars to donuts this has nothing to do with the coffee cup in the sink. There's something, you know, there's another issue here, and we actually have no idea what that would be because we have no single fact to go on. But in the context of the relation, and once again, this is the realm of speculation, and by way of suggesting the power of such an approach, empathy gives us consider that empathy, as you've suggested, may give us access in that distinguish what you're making it mean from, you know, what might actually be going on in the background.
Exactly, Lou. And when I slow down that interaction, what happens? I find out that in that woman's family, she could never figure out if her parents loved each other, because they in fact weren't very loving to each other, and they were always debating like what meant what. Like if you did this, or if we got a bigger home, your father or your mother would have, and they involved the children in this all the time. So she grew up looking for signs of what the hell is love? What is love? I can't see it. They're not very affectionate to each other. They don't say positive things to each other. So you look for items and things to show. You're trying to get your markers. Mm-hmm. And when we slow down that interaction, of course, by the end of 50 minutes, she realizes it's not about the dishwasher, and she has tears in her eyes because she's realizing I'm looking for to find out how you know if somebody loves you. And her husband leans over and he says, "I love you. I love you. I'm just not great with a dishwasher."
You know.
And they end in a different place.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. We're talking about the blocks to empathy. So everyone's bringing their blocks, throwing them in the middle of the room, and there's so many blocks on one of my websites. I think I've listed like 30 different blocks to empathy. You know, everything from all the ones that you've mentioned, and another 20 too of ways that you can block. You know, sympathy, etc., etc. So it's how do we work through that? It's like, here's the cap is not on the toothpaste, as was mentioned. Like, what do we do now? Like, everybody's irritated because the cap is not on the toothpaste, and you know, what's next? Do we go to see Arthur or Lou or whatever, or do we have some kind of a process to kind of work an empathic, some tools to work through that?
So one of the tools, Edwin, because it's an excellent question, is what not to do. Okay, so you don't put the toothpaste cap on the toothpaste. Now, I can't believe you did that. Are you stupid? Do you not get it? I told you I don't like that. That's what you don't do. You don't slander the person. You don't get angry. You try to slow it down, because we've gone over this 100 times. What are we really talking about? Normally, you got two intelligent people talking about toothpaste, or talking about the color of the door, or no, that door's black. No, I think it's a dark brown. And you say, you're really arguing about that? You start to help people learn, and you learn yourself that it isn't the little things. when you uncover, because people always say, oh, it's silly, I don't even want to talk about it, what bothered me. If you don't start looking at the layer, and I think, Lou, you're referring to this before, the psychodynamic piece, you don't peel back, what's the origin of it? The origin of it usually is a lack of empathy and a misperception. And you have to go back, so the toothpaste is the beginning, but then as you peel it back, you realize, just like the dishwasher for that woman, it wasn't about the dishwasher, it was about, how do I know he loves me? How do I know anybody loves me? We all want to know. But what are the real ways you could know? Not trying to figure out if somebody puts their coffee cup in a dishwasher. Look, you could have the neatest person in the world who has OCD. It doesn't mean they love you. But you have to peel it back. You cannot peel it back unless you slow down and listen. If you start getting angry with someone, and of course people do this a lot, instead of talking about it, they don't talk about it, they just act it out. When you slow down and you listen empathically, and when people learn that this is the way to be, this is the only way you get to the root of the issue, they want to practice it more and more. Why? Because it feels good. We live according to how we feel, you know, and we act according to our moods. When people realize that when you practice this, you feel good. You have more friends, you get along with more people, you have less arguments, you have less conflict, you have less stress, and you do become more resilient. You see people really want it because it works.
Well, so we have it. That's kind of like the benefits. Like, right, here's the toothpaste, this little incident that's causing this underlying, you know, stress and aggravation, and you know, that's kind of a general. How do we resolve it? Is through empathy. You know, not to judge and to start working through it. But what is the actual what are some actual mechanisms? Like, I do a process, what I call empathy circles, which is mutual, reflective, empathic listening. Like my partner and I, we do it at dinner time. Like I get to share, and then she reflects back what she's hearing me say, and then, you know, once I feel heard, then it's her turn to speak, and we go back and forth. And it's just a practice. I mean, that's kind of like one simple practice. I mean, you can go to a therapist or whatever, but then, you know, that's pretty expensive in the long term, you know, but you need like tools for little, you know, little issues and practices. So I guess what are practices we can have to, besides with reading the book, I guess would be another practice.
Well, in the book, you know, there's a lot of stories and examples of people who are misperceiving and how they learn to perceive accurately. And then I ask people at the end of each chapter, which piece do you identify with? Which cognitive distortion do you use? What's interfering with you seeing the truth in your partner or your friend or your spouse or your children? And I ask people to take action at the end of every chapter. Like, I want them to confide in someone and have a dialogue about it. So, I mean, and there are steps. For instance, you know, one of the steps I talk about in the book is to ask open-ended questions, because I say that, and I try to teach people that most questions are statements. Like, you know, do you really think you spoke well in that meeting? Well, that's not a question. That means I didn't think you spoke well, but I don't have the courage to tell you that, or I don't know how to tell you that with tact. When you ask open-ended questions, just like you were doing with your niece or nephew, Edwin, you were trying to understand, like, are you feeling angry? Not like, I know, I'm the authority. You're truly trying to understand. And that starts to open up the process, because empathy is very much focused on understanding. And understanding should always precede explaining. Rather than telling people, I know why you leave the toothpaste cap off. I don't know why. Or slowing it down and even saying, you know what, rather than us arguing about that, what is it about? I'm not sure why I get so irritated by it, and I'm not sure why you keep doing it. Can we slow down and have a discussion? And empathy goes out the window when the temperature gets too hot and too cold, when people are more isolated and removed and kind of cold, or when their voice is getting elevated and they're starting to release stress hormones and anger. It's trying to keep it somewhat calm so that we can ask open-ended questions, slow down the process. Most importantly, in that interaction, we learn from the past. And our partners and our friends learn about our past, where our biases are, how to unravel them and change them. Because when you know you're perceiving in a distorted way, I mean, most people automatically, when you acknowledge that, want to change it.
Okay, I want to open it for questions too from Betty and Crystal, if you had some more.
I've purchased both of your books, and I'm just referring back to the first one. So you say people can use empathy against you. So how would you prevent that from happening in a negative fashion?
By working out your own past so that you have less and less biases in perception yourself, so that I can assess you accurately. For instance, say I'm so fragile that what my real worry is what people think of me. So I'm so worried about what you think of me that I'm trying to please you, and I'm not really assessing you. You see this when people date all the time, especially after a divorce, right? Because they're thinking that, oh, I got divorced, I'm 50 years old, I'll never meet anybody again. So the first person they meet, they're anxious, they don't think they're very lovable because their husband or wife left them, and they're not really slowing down the process enough to even understand who they're with. So when you slow down and you reduce and keep working on learning how to perceive accurately and shedding some of your past distortions, I can assess you more accurately. Because now I'm not nervous to be with you. I'm not anxious about whether you're going to like me or not like me. I truly want to get to know you. And I'm open. I've got my wide lens camera because my empathy is available now, because I don't have stress and I'm not overly anxious. And now I'm able to pick up some cues. I notice how you treat the waiter. I noticed that you held the door open for the elderly woman behind you. Or I noticed that you didn't. Great example. We were going to open a Jerry Psych unit in the hospital I was working in. So I got this thing from the CEO of the hospital that I should hire this PhD from Harvard because he wrote a lot of papers on the elderly and blah blah blah. It's a snowy day. I'm running in the hospital and I'm late for the interview. And I see this fella. I open the door and I come in, and then I turn around and I see this fella in a three-piece suit, and there's an elderly woman in a walker, and he lets the door slam on her. And he looks right at her, and the door slams on her, and he keeps walking. And I studied his face, and I went in another elevator, and come to find out, he's the person I'm going to interview. So, okay, so maybe I could have been intimidated by the fact that he's from Harvard Medical School, and I should hire him, he wrote all these papers, but I looked at him, and I said, at the end of the interview, I said, you know, I realize you look very familiar. And he said, no, I don't think we've ever met. I said, I saw you this morning when we were running in the middle of I was running in the snow, and you came in, and the elderly woman was behind you, and he said, yeah. And I could see just when he said, yeah, there was a defensiveness. I said, I saw you let the door slam on her walker. And there was dead silence. He goes, what's that supposed to mean? I said, I'm just wondering, you're supposed to be an expert with the elderly. I was late for the interview. I said, the interview's over. So that's an example of not going by people's resumes, their titles, their degrees, but observing all the variables.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like the core to that, so the question as I was hearing it is that how do we see people who, what was it, who are not being empathic or who are kind of being manipulative, and that, I don't know if I get that, and that you're saying that it's about calmness, that if we really get calm and then see, so it would be like practicing calmness to be more aware of what's happening. I don't know if I quite got this all right.
Yes, but you know, one of the things I wanted to comment too, and I can understand the value of the empathy circle that you talk about, Edwin. But I also think we have to learn how to do this in real life, in real time. That's what happens in group therapy, because people are interacting in a very interactive format, and you see it come out in real time. Because in the world, we can't always have people sit, and I speak and then you speak, and sometimes people interrupt, and you're in a staff meeting. It's, you have to learn it in the real environment, because that's where it's pretty rare. When you're sitting down with someone else who's very much wanting to do it with you, it's easier to do. But I think part of your question was, how do you do it with people that aren't that way? Or how do you even assess who is or isn't that way?
Mm-hmm. So that's where the calmness is. It sounds like you're really trying to cultivate a calmness in dealing with all people so that you can be more aware and more empathic and read the signs better.
You read the signs when you know more and more and more of your biases, and that's one of the key ways of maintaining intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm misreading you all the time, how can I stay in touch with you as a close friend? Or how can I stay in touch with my wife, or you with your partner? Because I'm so sensitive. Now you're acting. I think she's acting like you think she's acting like your mother, or I think she's acting like my father, or you realize we all have a past, but you keep filtering it out more and more and more, and your partner gets to know where your sensitivities are, but we hold each other responsible for correcting them.
Mm-hmm.
We learn from our biases from the past. We rewrite the story. I always say
sort of like learning in real time. So you're kind of learning in real time.
Because you're learning in a real relationship.
Mm-hmm. So what I would say about the empathy circles, because this is like a real proponent of this process, is I use the metaphor of exercise. Like you can go out into the world and run around and just develop your muscles through running, just through living life. But you can also do exercises. You can do the curls. You can do the weight lifts or what have you. So I guess I see the empathy circle as sort of this resilience building that I found that by doing this practice, it actually builds this underlying, maybe that calmness you're talking about, this resilience, so that when I do go into like super stressful conflict situations, people screaming at each other, that I have enough presence and calmness, even though it's like terrifying, to listen to both sides and then to offer empathy, because to me it's quite amazing how scary it is to hold an empathic presence in the middle of like crazy fights. It's really hard. I mean, it's like I've felt just icicles going through my veins trying to hold that presence, and I'm sure that's in your groups that's probably similar.
And I can definitely see the value of it, because you're practicing. The real test of whether you're really growing and expanding your capacity for empathy is when you're in the middle of conflict. If you and I are sitting calmly and we're practicing empathy, that gives us some of the tools and some of the foundation and fundamentals. When you really know if it's inside and internally, if it's become part of someone's internal structure, is when they're in conflict. You're angry with me, or we have a difference of opinion, and it's very close to us, or you hurt my feelings. Now, it's the awareness in every relationship is we're raising our voices. Wait a minute. Somebody raises the flag and say, slow down. Come on, I want to have a reasonable discussion with you. Rather than it escalating, we've learned that, this is where you really hurt me. Because when those things come up, when it becomes very sensitive and vulnerable, that's when it's hardest to be empathic. And that's when it's most important. That's the real test. And I see it in group situations all the time, because when someone is criticized or someone hurts someone else, that's when you see the tempers go up or somebody withdraws, and you try to bring them back to and help people learn that somebody has to recognize that the direction we're going in right now in this conflict is not fruitful.
And are you doing that as the facilitator, kind of bring that energy in?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
because that's a whole nother method. It's like everybody doesn't have a facilitator at their beck and call in the middle of conflict, because if you're kind of holding the space, I mean, that's great. I think, facilitators are really important. And
but if you were in one of my groups for an hour and a half, I might not say anything for the first 50 minutes because they're doing it themselves. I only step in when I see people having trouble doing it for themselves. But I watch people work it out, and you see that the veterans, the people that have been in longer, they very rarely need my input. The new people do sometimes, but sometimes we'll go an hour and a half and I may make 4 comments because I don't need to, because they're doing it themselves.
Mm-hmm. The group has kind of internalized it then.
Yes, they've become part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we have time for one more question for closing. Crystal, did you have anything, or was?
No, I've just enjoyed participating through the listening side of things.
Okay.
Well, there are an almost infinite number of questions, and I'm not going to ask one. I'm going to rather acknowledge you, Arthur, and you, Edwin, and everybody on the call for your all empathy and the commitment to making empathy present. What I learned and what I got the most out of was the description or how removing the obstacles to empathy enables empathy to show up and unfold. That's a very powerful lesson, and I acknowledge that, and I'm gonna, I'm working on that. Great minds think alike. I'm working on it, and I also was engaged by the example of the woman who was coming up and trying to figure out how her parents were expressing or not expressing love for one another, and it was very ambiguous and very fraught and very confusing. I mean, she got years of training in how to get crazy around the expression of love. I use that sort of loosely. It's not clinical, but that, I mean, I can think of individuals that I know who are doing something similar. They've had years of practice, and empathy is powerful in getting access to that and breaking it up on a good day. And the secret sauce, basically, I'm going to try to net it out here, but the secret sauce, if this were the only experience that I had with you, is to slow down the process. That produces a lot of the results, or at least the action that you're calling forth. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. I mean, this is the realm of tips and techniques, you know. So I'm going to be working on that. And also the very confronting and interesting guy, like a psychopath like Hitler, right? And we can think of all, he's just at the top of the list, but there are other, may actually be using some form of empathy, distorted, or, we can debate, the debate goes on. But I think that's an interesting and powerful point to note, too. Like, I mean, right, Simon Baron-Cohen's 0 degrees of empathy, and the mindedness there is also, that debate we haven't solved, but at least called out. So I thank you and honor the work you're doing. I really look forward to reading the books that I have on order, and you're doing something right. I mean, this is the book I wish I would have written. Let me just say, this is the book I wish I would have written. I've written a couple, and they're good. Everybody should buy multiple copies and read all of them. But it sounds like you've got the book, and if I may say so, I wish I would have written it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
Thanks, Lou. Yeah, this is, I think, really core, that you've really hit a core kind of a nerve here, Arthur, with, about the stress, the cortisol, empathy, transforming that into oxytocin and connection and well-being. I think that basic formula, understanding, I think everybody can relate to and is in need of. So I think it's very, very much needed, very clearly laid out. So.
And I think we should probably all practice empathy towards ourselves. And a good way to demonstrate empathy would be to perhaps put the toothpaste cap on. Cap is off, and it's bothering you. Just
what about the dishwasher?
Or if you see the
that also.
cup on the counter, just take it and put it in the dishwasher. That's practicing empathy.
That's a very good point, because oftentimes it's those little things. And even though it may be idiosyncratic, you may like the bed turned one way and somebody else the other way. You do it that way because it'll make the other person happy, and it's a small thing. Yes, that is empathy. Because you're paying attention to what means something to someone, and they're not asking you to break a leg or run to New Jersey. It's just a little thing, and you could do it.
Well, okay. Well, I think that's it with our time. So I want to thank everyone for taking part in this, and our audience, and Arthur for sharing your insights and experiences and your book. And we're talking about creating a course around this. So stay tuned for more information about that as we progress.
Well, thank you very much. It was very enjoyable to sit in on this.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Edwin.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye, Lou. Bye, Betty. Bye, Crystal.
Okay.
See you, Arthur.
Bye, Edwin.